Hey there. One of the issues many developers and DevOps engineers face is managing custom CI/CD workflows. And to help solve this, they have turned to using tools such as Travis CI or Jenkins. But if you've used any of these tools, you quickly find out that these are very complicated tools. In addition to the fact that you have an extra server to manage, and that is the CI/CD server that they will be running on. On the other hand, we have much simpler tools such as GitHub Actions and GitLab pipelines. But if you're running something a little bit more complex or advanced, you'll find that these tools lack in functionality. So how do you manage functionality with customization and power? That is what I'll be showing you in this video. In this video, I'd like to show you how to use Appsmith to manage your custom CI/CD workflows and pipelines. We are going to be building a dashboard such as the one shown on the screen. And what this dashboard does is that it manages deployment to multiple servers. So for instance, clicking on the Trigger a New Pipeline button, we can select a branch we want to deploy from, and then we can select a server we want to deploy to. And then clicking on the Trigger button would actually cause the deployment of whatever we have on the staging branch, for example, to be on the server we have selected, server 2 in this case. And we have a table showing the history of the pipelines that we have previously run. We can click on this button to view information about the pipeline. We can also retry a pipeline, we can cancel a running pipeline, or we can entirely delete a pipeline. So this is what I will be showing you how to build using Appsmith so that you can manage whatever custom workflow you have configured for your CI/CD process. The demo app we'll be using is a simple Node.js server on GitLab. And we can see that it is a Hello World Node.js server. Going back to GitLab, the configuration file we have is pretty simple because it has just two stages. It has a test stage and a deploy stage. For the test stage, we are simply running a test. And for the deploy stage, we are using DPL, which is a Ruby gem to deploy to Heroku. For that to work, we need to pass in two variables, which is the app name and also our Heroku API key. And on Heroku, we have two servers configured. We have the Appsmith CI/CD server 1 and the Appsmith CI/CD server 2. And we can see them live in action right here. So going back to the dashboard, we are going to build this entire functionality using the GitLab API and then add some features that are not provided by default on GitLab. So this is what we are going to be building, and let's get started. For us to get started, let us head over to the applications panel on Appsmith, and we'll go ahead to create a new app. The first widget I'll be bringing into view would be a table widget, which would allow us to see the history of pipelines we have run. So for that, I have brought a table widget into view, and I'm just going to make this a little bit more big so that we can see everything we have showing up on the table. In order to display data into this table, I would need to use the GitLab Get Pipelines API to fetch data from my repository and display on this table. So I'll need to configure an API, and for that I'll need to head over to the API section, and I'll be creating a new API. To make things a little bit easy, Appsmith has this feature of using API endpoints as data source so that they can be easily reused across multiple endpoints or APIs on the app. So for that, I'm going to be creating a new data source. I would start by typing the URL of the data source, https gitlab.com/API/v4. So we are going to see the Save as Data Source button. Click on it, and then we have the option to configure this data source. I'm going to call this data source GitLab API. And for the endpoint of the API, this would be gitlab.com/API/v4 and /projects, and then my project ID. To get my project ID, I'll need to head back to my repository on GitLab. And right under the project name, I can see my project ID. So I'm just going to copy this over and use it right here on my endpoint. The next configuration we'll need to do on this data source would be to provide a private token. And the private token would be an access token gotten from our GitHub account. So for this, I am going to configure private token. And the value of the private token will be gotten from my GitHub account. So let's head back to GitHub, Preferences, and let us head over to the Access Token section. So let us provide a name for this private token, and we are going to give it access to the API. I am going to click on the Create button, and we'll have a new private token created for us. So I'm just going to copy this over, and I'm going to use this as the value of my header. So I am going to save this. Going back to the API we wanted to create, now we can see that the endpoint is automatically pre-filled for us. That is because we have configured the data source. So let's give this endpoint a name. Let's call this get pipelines. And it is going to be a get request. And this get request will be hitting the pipelines API. So we have this configured. I'm going to hit the run button so that we are sure that this works properly. And we can see we have an array of pipelines returned to us from the GitLab API. All right, so let's use the data gotten from our Get Pipelines API on the table. For that, I'm just going to configure this table and set the table data to be read from the Get Pipelines endpoint.data. And we can see information coming from the API is shown up on the table. I'm going to customize this a bit so that we do not have too much information on the table. So I'm going to turn off the web URL column. I'm also going to turn off the updated art column. I am also going to turn off the SHA column, such that we only have the ID column showing up. We also have the ref, we have the status, and we have the created art. The next functionality I would like to build into this dashboard is the ability to trigger a new pipeline. For that, I would need a button widget, and I am just going to grab that into view. Let us call this trigger new pipeline. And we want to touch that when this button is clicked, a modal is shown where we can input the parameters of the pipeline we want to be triggered. So for that, I'm just going to drag in a modal. I'm going to set this modal to a form modal, and I'm just going to rearrange things a little bit so that we have more room. For the form, we will need 2 drop-downs, and we will also need some text widgets to properly label the drop-downs we have. For the first drop-down, this would be the branch we want to deploy from. So I'm just going to call this branch. And for the option, we have 2 branches on our GitLab repository. We have the master branch and the staging branch. So those would be the options that would be showing right here on the drop-down. So I'm going to call this master, and I'm going to call this master. And for the next label, this will be staging, and this will also be staging. And we do not need this, so I'll get rid of that. And for the default option, I'm going to set this to master. All right, so the next label would be for the server we want to deploy to. So I'm just going to call this server. And we would need to pass the server name as options for the dropdown. We have 2 servers, the Appsmith CI/CD server 1 and the Appsmith CI/CD server 2. So those are the options that I'm going to use in this dropdown. So I'm going to call this Appsmith CI/CD server 1, and the same goes for the label. the value rather. And for the second label, this will be Appsmith CI/CD server 2, and the same goes for the value. And I would not need the third option as well. For the default option, I'm going to keep server 1 as default. And I'm just going to drag this a little bit so that we have a little bit more room to see what is going on. All right, so we have our modal configured. Let us head back to our button to configure it such that when it is clicked on, the modal we just have configured would show up. So for the on click, I am going to say open modal, and I'm going to pass in modal 1. So whenever this button is clicked on, we have our modal showing up. Then we want the create pipeline API to be called whenever the confirm button is clicked. And we also want it such that the parameters passed from this form would be sent to the API, and then the pipeline will be triggered based on those parameters. So to enable that, let us go back to the APIs, and then we would configure a new endpoint to create pipelines. So I'm just going to call this create pipeline. And this is going to be a post request. We'll be using our Gitlab Datasource we have configured, and this will be /pipeline. Since this is a post request, we would need to pass some parameters to the body of this post request, especially the variables we want coming from our form to this endpoint. And for that, I'm going to paste in something I already have copied. All right, so the first parameter that will be passing to this API is the ref, and this refers to the branch we want the pipeline to be run on. So for that, we'll be pulling the branch we want the pipeline to be run on from the first drop down we have on the modal. So this will be drop down 1 dot selected value. And for variables, we have 2 variables. On the configuration file, we can see we specified 2 variables. We have the Heroku app name, and we have the Heroku API key. The app name being the server we want to deploy to, and then the API key being the access token coming from Heroku. So let us configure the app name. For the app name, we'll be grabbing the value from the second drop down we have configured on our modal. And for that, this will be drop down 2 dot selected option value. And lastly, we want to configure the API key. For the API key, you would need to head over to your Heroku dashboard. Under the settings section, scroll down to where you have API key, and there you can copy or generate a new API key. So for that, I'm going to copy what I have here, and I am going to use that as the value of the API key. So we have the body properly configured. I'm going to hit the run button to see if everything works fine. And you can see we get a message saying that everything works fine. So let us go back and configure the modal such that when the confirm button is clicked, it calls the create pipeline API. So for that, I'm going to open the modal, and I'm going to configure the confirm button to call the create pipeline API whenever it is clicked. So for the on click, I am going to say call an API, and I'm going to select create pipeline. But in reality, we want to do more than just call the create pipeline endpoint. We want to also close this modal automatically when the button is clicked, and we want to refresh the list of pipelines we have showing up on the table we have on the dashboard. So for that, I'm going to enable JavaScript, and I would want to call the get pipelines API .run. And when it's finished running, I'll also like to close this modal. And I'm going to pass the name of this modal. This is modal 1. All right, so we have everything configured. Let us walk through and see if it works properly. I'm going to click on the trigger new pipeline. I'm going to set a branch staging, and I'm going to deploy this to server 2. I'm going to click on confirm, and let us see if this works. All right, so we can see that that works, and the new pipeline we just configured, or we just triggered, has a status of running. At this point, I'd like to show you a few more features we can add to the dashboard to better control the process of our workflow. The first feature I'd like to add to this dashboard will be the ability to view the pipeline on GitLab. So for that, I'm going to add a new column. I'm going to configure this column and call it view. I'll set the column type to button, and for the label, I'll call this view. Let us set the color to blue because it says view. And for the onClick, we want to call an API. We don't want to call an API. We actually want to navigate to a page. And for the page name, we are going to grab this from the table data. So this will be current row dot web URL. And for the query params, we do not want any query params. And we want this to open in a new window. So let us click on the button and see if this works. I'm going to click on this pipeline I have here. And we can see we are taken to the related page on GitLab where we can see more information about this pipeline. So let's close this up. Next up, I'd like to add another functionality for us to retry a pipeline. So for that, I would need to create a new custom column. I'm going to call this retry. And let's go in to configure it. This will also be a button, and the label will be retry. I'm going to set this to green, and I want to run an API call whenever this button is clicked. So for that, I would need to create an API for this button, and I'm going to call this retry pipeline. So this is going to be a post request, and I'll be grabbing the Gitlab Datasource. All right, moving on with the configuration of this endpoint, I would need to hit the pipelines route, and I also need to pass across the ID of the pipeline we want to retry. For that, I'll be grabbing it from the table. So this will be table1.selected row.id. And this would evaluate to be the ID of the pipeline that was clicked on the table and the retry endpoint. All right, so we have this configured. I'm going to hit on the run button to see if everything works fine. And we can see we have a status of success, so this means it works. All right, let's head back to our table and link that API to the button we have configured. All right, so we already have it linked up here. What we want to do is that we would need to call the get pipelines API on sources so that the table we have here will be refreshed with the most updated data. For that, I'm going to click on the colon API and set the get pipelines API to be called whenever we click on retry. So clicking on this would trigger a pipeline retry, and then we have our table properly refreshed. So let us add another feature to cancel the pipeline. And for that, we would need to add a new column. We are going to call this the cancel column. And we'll set this also to be a button. For the action label, we are going to say cancel. And I'm going to set the color to yellow. We'll need to call an action whenever this is clicked, and I'm going to create a new API. This will be the cancel API that cancels a running pipeline. So let's call this cancel pipeline. And this is going to be a post request. I'm going to be using the Gitlab Datasource, and this will be /pipelines. Then the ID of the pipeline we want to cancel. I'm going to be grabbing this from the table. And then the cancel routes. So running this will cancel whatever pipeline that is selected on the table. So let us see if this works. and we can see that we have a success message. Let us configure the cancel button to also get the pipelines data whenever the cancel API runs successfully. So for that, I would set the onSuccess to call an API, and it is going to call the get pipelines API. So hitting on the cancel button would cancel a running pipeline and then refresh the information shown on the table. Lastly, let us configure an action to delete a pipeline. For that, let's create a new custom column, and we are going to set this to delete. This is going to be a button, and the button is going to say delete. Color of the button will be red because we want people to be sure they really want to delete whenever they click on this button. And for the action, we are going to call an API. We are going to be configuring a new endpoint to actually delete the pipeline. So let's give this API a name, delete pipeline. And this is going to be a delete request. I'm going to be using my Gitlab Datasource. And this will be hitting the pipelines / the ID of the pipeline we want to delete. And this will be coming from the table. It's selected row.id. And running this would delete the pipeline selected on the table. So let's click on this, and it ran successfully, but because this is a delete request, it does not return any response. So let's head back to the table and make sure that when the delete API runs successfully, we have our table refreshed. So we're going to call an API, and we're going to call the get pipelines API. All right, so we have everything properly configured right here on our table. I am going to adjust this a little bit so that we have everything showing up. So now we have the ability to trigger a new pipeline by clicking on the trigger button, and we can set the branch we want to deploy to. We can also set the server we want to deploy to, and clicking on the confirm button deploys to that server. Then we can click on the view pipeline button to see the information about the related pipeline. We can also retry a pipeline. We can cancel a running pipeline. Okay, that didn't work. And we can also delete the pipeline. And that pipeline is deleted. So this is how we can easily manage our CI/CD workflow by creating a dashboard on Appsmith to manage the entire process for us. And we can see the dashboard we built here is quite similar to the finished product we have over here. I'm just going to take a moment to add some customization to make this look a little bit more appealing. But basically, what we have here is the same as the dashboard we have here, and everything works as expected. So in this way, you can easily manage your CI/CD workflow using Appsmith.